Chapter 1, Applying Psychology to Teaching. After studying this chapter, you will be able to state the main focus of educational psychology, explain how learning about educational psychology will help make you a better teacher, describe the limitations of a non-scientific approach to solving education-related problems and the strengths of a scientific approach, describe how the limited focus of research, the complexity of teaching and learning, differences in how educational psychologists select and interpret research findings, and the accumulation of knowledge over time complicates the scientific study of behavior and thought processes. Explain what it means to say that good teaching is partially an art and partially a science. Describe the concept of teaching as inquiry, and explain how it contributes to a teacher's effectiveness. As you begin to read this book, you may be asking yourself, what will this book tell me about teaching that I don't already know? After all, I've been in school for more than 12 years and have observed dozens of teachers, and teaching is nothing more than telling others what I know. You may not realize, at least not yet, what you may not realize is that you likely have significant gaps in your knowledge about the factors that affect teaching and learning. You may also have formed incorrect beliefs about how to teach others and about how people learn in classroom settings. Your primary goal then is to help you fill in these gaps and create more accurate beliefs by explaining how you can use various psychological theories, concepts, and principles to become an effective classroom teacher. The purpose of this first chapter is to tell you a little bit about the field of educational psychology, why we think research on various aspects of teaching and classroom learning can help you become an effective teacher, and how you can best use research findings to achieve your teaching goals. So let's start with a comment and question that the two of us have heard from various people, including teachers, many times in our careers. I've never heard of educational psychology. What is it all about? What is educational psychology? Educational psychology is a branch of psychology that is concerned with understanding and improving how students acquire a variety of capabilities through formal instruction in classroom settings. David Berliner, 2006, for example, described educational psychology as a scientific discipline that uses psychological concepts and research methods to understand how the various characteristics of students, teachers, learning tasks, and educational settings interact to produce the everyday behaviors common in school settings. Because educational psychology is a scientific discipline, we will be describing one of its most important tools in just about every chapter: theory. Many people mistakenly think that a theory is nothing more than an unproven, off-the-top-of-the-head speculation about some topic. Let's put that view to rest right now. In a scientific context, a theory is a proposed explanation of some phenomenon that is based in part on already existing facts. Scientists then use what they already know to propose a tentative explanation of how something works that can be tested. The nature of theory and its relationship to research and practice should become clearer to you as you move through the book. Some of the factors that psychological theories are concerned with and that affect how teachers teach and students learn include the learner's physical, social, emotional, and cognitive development, cultural, social, emotional, and intellectual differences, learning and problem-solving processes, self-esteem, motivation, testing, and measurement to formulate effective instructional lessons. In the next section, we'll explain why learning about these topics is worth your time and effort. How will learning about educational psychology help you to be a better teacher? There's no question that knowledge of psychological concepts and their application to educational settings has the potential to help you be a better teacher. Whether that potential is ever fulfilled depends on how willing you are to maintain an open mind and a positive attitude. We say this because educational research is often described as being neither useful nor influential. As you read through the next few paragraphs and the subsequent chapters, you will see that criticisms like this are easily rebutted. We offer a three-pronged argument. Teaching is a complex enterprise. Research can inform teachers, and professional coursework contributes to competence. To explain how educational psychology can help you be a better teacher, whether you plan to teach in an elementary school, a middle school, or a high school. Teaching is a complex enterprise. The first part of our argument is that teaching is not the simple, straightforward enterprise some people imagine it to be. In fact, it ranks in the top quartile on complexity for all occupations. And several analyses included teachers in the same occupational group as accountants, architects, computer programmers, counselors, engineers, and lawyers. Marilyn Cochran Smith, 2003, for many years the editor of the Journal of Teacher Education, has characterized teaching as unforgivingly complex. While there are many reasons for this complexity, two stand out. First, while teachers usually work with diverse groups of students who have varied and sometimes contradictory needs, each student needs to be understood as an individual learner. But perhaps most fundamentally, the complexity of teaching derives from its decision-making nature. Teachers are constantly making decisions, before and after instruction as well as on the spot. Linda Darling Hammond, a leading teacher educator, notes that teachers must be able to understand and respond to the dense and multifaceted nature of the classroom, juggling multiple academic and social goals requiring trade-offs from moment to moment and day to day. Here's an insightful observation about teaching that highlights its complexity. Mathematicians need to understand a problem only for themselves. Math teachers need both to know the math and to know how 30 different minds might understand or misunderstand it. Then they need to take each mind from not getting it to mastery. And they need to do this in 45 minutes or less. Educational psychology offers many useful ideas that can help you cope with the complexity of teaching. But for reasons that we elaborate later on in the chapter and at other points in the book, it does not, in most cases, provide specific prescriptions about how to handle particular problems. Rather, it gives you general principles that you can use in a flexible manner. Fortunately, the research literature contains a wealth of these ideas. Research that informs teachers. The second part of our argument pertains to the potential usefulness of educational psychology research. Contrary to the negative opinions that were reported by Miller et al. And Patrick et al., the research literature contains numerous studies that were conducted under realistic classroom conditions and offer useful ideas for improving instruction. As you read through each chapter in the book, you will find solid support for the instructional practices we describe. Another source of useful research is the What Works Clearinghouse. This research, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education, was designed to provide educators with information about how well various types of instructional programs they might be interested in adopting are supported by research. What makes this site so useful is that each program is judged according to the same set of rigorous standards. Reports are available on 15 topics, including academic achievement, dropout prevention, educational technology, math, science, literacy, student behavior, and special needs. Being aware of and consulting the WWC site will leave you better informed than most of your colleagues. A 2010 survey by the Government Accountability Office found that 58% of school administrators had never heard of the What Works Clearinghouse, which means that decisions about which programs to adopt, many of which are sold commercially and are very expensive, are made on the basis of a persuasive sales pitch or a recommendation from a colleague. Doing What Works is another website maintained by the U.S. Department of Education that provides research-based evidence on various practices and programs, such as a response to intervention in primary grade reading, teaching literacy to K-5 English language learners, encouraging girls in math and science, and reducing behavior problems. Analyses of research on mathematics, reading, science, early childhood education, and comprehensive school reform can be found on the website of the Johns Hopkins University's Center for Data-Driven Reform in Education. Called the Best Evidence Encyclopedia, this site summarizes the results of research reviews that meet high standards of quality and usefulness. Each program that is reviewed is then assigned to one of 4 categories, depending on the amount and strength of the evidence. As much as we value the contribution that research can make to your effectiveness as a teacher, and hope that you will make consistent use of it in the future, you need to put research in its proper context. For reasons we mention in a later section of this chapter, you should keep in mind that the knowledge produced by science, particularly with respect to classroom learning, is usually qualified and temporary. A few pages also, we described educational psychology, a few pages ago we described educational psychology as a discipline that studies how characteristics of students, teachers, learning tasks, and educational settings interact to produce the outcomes that will be of interest to you. Consequently, the insights you seek from research should be specific. For which students will this idea likely work best? Under what circumstances? With what kinds of tasks? For what kinds of outcomes? Rather than general, will my students benefit more from A than B? In other words, keep reminding yourself that nothing works for everybody in any and all circumstances. Notice also that we talked about research providing you with insights rather than definitive answers. Our choice of wording here is quite deliberate. Research in any field is a matter of adding to, taking away from, and revising an existing body of knowledge. For all practical purposes, we never get to the point where we say, this is what we know, and it will always be so. Instead, researchers say, this is what we know for now. That's why we prefer that you treat research findings as providing you with insights or guidelines rather than hard and fast answers. As we explain a little bit later in this chapter, the ability to take basic insights from research and tailor them to a classroom's ever-changing circumstances is what defines the teacher who is an artistic scholar or one who combines the art and science of teaching. Coursework and competence. The third part of our argument that educational psychology can help you be a better teacher concerns the courses you are currently taking, particularly this educational psychology course. Many researchers have asked, how do the courses teachers take as students relate to how capable they perceive themselves to be as teachers? One means that researchers have used to determine the answer has been to ask beginning teachers to rate how prepared they feel to handle a variety of classroom tasks. Surveys of beginning teachers reveal that they are highly satisfied with how well their training has prepared them to deal with certain classroom challenges, but are dissatisfied with their preparation for addressing other challenges. On the plus side, most beginning teachers reported that their training adequately prepared them to teach a specific subject, provide individualized instruction, manage the behavior of students in their classroom, and understand the impact of children's cognitive, social, and emotional development on learning. On the negative side, beginning teachers felt their teacher education programs did not do enough to prepare them to deal with children with special needs, children from ethnically and racially diverse backgrounds, assessing learning, and interpreting test results to students and parents. This textbook will address all of these issues, including those about which teachers have reported discomfort. Our belief is that this course and this book will be one important means for helping you feel prepared to enter your first classroom. Despite feeling less than fully prepared to deal with special needs students, ethnically and culturally diverse students, and aspects of classroom assessment, beginning teachers who earned their certification from a standard teacher education program reported higher levels of satisfaction with the quality of their training than did teachers who earned their certification through alternative means, as the Teach for America program, New Teachers Project, and Troops to Teachers program. In one survey, 80% of traditionally trained and certified first-year teachers felt they were prepared for their first year of teaching, whereas only 50% of alternative route teachers felt adequately prepared. Similarly, 74% of traditionally trained teachers felt they spent enough time working with classroom teachers during their training, whereas only 31% of alternative routes teachers felt that way. Although it is reassuring to know that most beginning teachers have a generally favorable opinion of the quality of their preparation programs, researchers have also asked if the graduates of such programs provide high-quality instruction to their students. There are two types of evidence that shed some light on this issue. First, several studies found that the students of certified teachers scored higher on standardized achievement tests than did the students of teachers with non-standard certification, even though these teachers were judged to have had a good understanding of their subject matter. The value added by being trained in an accredited teacher education program and receiving standard certification is something called pedagogical content knowledge. It involves both knowing about and knowing how to use the contents of this book and those from other courses to present lessons in various subjects that are interesting, meaningful, and engaging. Research shows that students of math teachers who were judged to have high levels of pedagogical content knowledge learned more than did students whose teachers lacked this characteristic but were considered nonetheless to be highly knowledgeable about mathematics. Second, the grades teachers earned in their teacher preparation program and their performance during student teaching were better predictors of how effective they were as teachers than were their scores on a standardized teacher certification test. The nature and values of science. The primary purpose of this book is to offer suggestions on how psychology, the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, might be applied to teaching. This text is based on the premise that information reported by scientists can be especially useful for those who plan to teach. Some of the reasons for this conviction become apparent when the characteristics of science are examined and compared with the limitations of casual observation. Limitations of non-scientific reasoning. Those who think unscientifically about the world in which they live may be easily misled into drawing false conclusions. One way this happens is by mistaking correlation for cause and effect. In other words, when two events occur close together in time, and when logic suggests that one could have been the cause of the other, many people jump to the conclusion that the first event did in fact cause the second. Here's a common example. A person goes to the doctor for a flu shot and comes down with the flu a few days later and concludes that the flu shot caused the flu, despite being told that the vaccine contained a dead virus. What people ignore when they think this way are alternative explanations, such as contracting the flu just after the shot. It takes the immune system about 2 weeks to create antibodies to the dead virus contained in the vaccine, or contracting a strain of the flu that was not contained in the vaccine. Another common mistake is to generalize from a single example. Many teachers conclude, for example, that because a previously uninterested student was motivated by praise, all students will react in a similar fashion. Often they do not. What teachers ignore when they think this way is the possibility that other students are not motivated by praise, or that praise may not work with students whose self-concepts are very weak. In short, unsystematic observers are especially prone to noting only evidence that fits their expectations and ignoring evidence that does not. One example of how operating from a non-scientific basis leads to pure educational decisions is the practice of retaining children for a second year in a given grade because of poor achievement. The percentage of students in grades K through 12 in the United States who had ever been retained was 9.8% for 2007, with the highest rate, 22.9%, occurring among students from low-income families. Retention is often seen as a relatively inexpensive way to bring underachieving students up to grade level standards, but it really is not when you consider that the average school spent $9,553 per student during the 2005-2006 school year. Clearly, keeping students in school longer than normal has a significant monetary cost. To some extent, retention rates are related to the growth of state learning standards and high-stakes testing programs, which we discuss in Chapter 15 on standardized tests. School districts are often required to retain students whose test scores fall below a certain level. Support for grade retention rests on the following assumption. Students who repeat a grade will, by the end of the repeated year, have a better understanding of that grade's subject matter and skills than similar peers who were promoted. As a result, their learning gains the following year will be better than those of their promoted peers. So how well is this assumption supported by research findings? Rather poorly. Primary grade students who have been retained typically perform no better the following year than their non-retained counterparts, and elementary grade students often perform worse. In addition, students who were retained are more likely to drop out of school. So why, in the face of overwhelming negative evidence, does grade retention continue to be practiced? We can think of two reasons that reflect non-scientific thinking. First, the assumption we described above is very intuitively appealing. It just seems logical that giving students a second opportunity to master a particular grade's knowledge base and skills will produce higher achievement in subsequent grades. A position that is backed by what appears to be an ironclad logic can quickly become an unshakable belief. A second reason is that people tend to overgeneralize from the exceptional case in which the outcome was positive. The reason retention does not work is simple. It does not address the causes of students' poor performance. These students typically begin school with more poorly developed academic skills, more serious health problems, and less stable home environments than their peers. In addition, retained students receive the same type of instruction and material the second time around. The best way to minimize, if not avoid, the use of retention is to provide developmentally, cognitively, and culturally appropriate forms of instruction. The major goal of this text is to help you know how to provide such instruction as a teacher. Strengths of scientific observation. Now that we've described the major shortcomings of operating on the basis of common knowledge, or personal experience, or intuition if you prefer those terms, it's time to examine what makes a scientific approach to the study of behavior more useful. Most scientific studies have the following 5 characteristics, which we can designate with the labels sampling, control, objectivity, publication, and replication. In most cases, researchers study a representative sample of subjects, so that individual idiosyncrasies can be canceled out. An effort is made to note all plausible hypotheses to explain a given type of behavior, and each hypothesis is tested under controlled conditions. If all factors but one can be held constant in an experiment, the researcher may be able to trace the impact of a given condition by comparing the behaviors of those who have been exposed to it and those who have not. Scientific observations make special efforts to be objective and guard against being misled by predetermined ideas, wishful thinking, or selected evidence. Observations are made in a carefully prescribed, systematic manner, which makes it possible for different observers to compare reactions. Complete reports of experiments, including descriptions of subjects, methods, results, and conclusions, are published in professional journals. This dissemination allows other experimenters to replicate a study to discover if they obtain the same results. The existence of reports of thousands of experiments makes it possible to discover what others have done. This knowledge can then serve as a starting point for one's own speculations. Complicating factors in the study of behavior and thought processes. Although the use of scientific methods makes it possible to overcome many of the limitations of non-scientific thinking, applying research findings to classroom settings is not as straightforward as you might think because of several complicating factors. What follows is a brief description of several factors that sometimes frustrate both researchers and practitioners. The limited focus of research. Human behavior is complex, changes with age, and has many causes. A student may perform poorly on a history exam, for example, for one or more of the following reasons: poorly developed study skills, inattentiveness in class, low interest in the subject, a poorly written text, low motivation to achieve high grades, vaguely worded exam questions, and difficulty with a particular type of exam question. Compare and contrast essays, for example. To understand how these factors affect performance on school-related tasks, research psychologists study at most only a few of them at a time under conditions that may not be entirely realistic. Imagine that a researcher is interested in comparing lectures versus problem-solving exercises in terms of their effect on conceptual understanding. The researcher may recruit subjects who are equivalent in terms of social class, prior knowledge of the topic of the reading passage, and age, randomly assign them to either a teacher who mostly lectures or one who assigns problems to solve, and then examine each group's responses to several types of comprehension items. There's nothing inherently wrong with this approach. You just have to understand that the results relate most directly to the type of person who participated in the study and the circumstances under which the study was conducted. Change any of the variables and you might not get the same result. But by combining and interrelating separate studies that have looked at different aspects of the same problem, we can apply the findings to a wider range of people and circumstances. The complexity of teaching and learning. David Berliner, a leading educational researcher, considers the scientific study of education to be the hardest to do science of them all, for at least two reasons. First, it is difficult to implement research findings and programs uniformly because schools and classrooms differ from one another along such lines as quality and quantity of personnel, teaching methods, budget, leadership, and community support. Thus, a program or technique may work just as the research says it should in one district or teacher's class, but not in another class or district. Second, the outcomes of schooling that teachers, students, and parents typically value are the result of complex interactions among numerous variables. This is true for both cognitive outcomes and affective outcomes. Achievement may, for example, be the result of interactions among students' characteristics such as prior knowledge, interests, and socioeconomic levels, teacher characteristics, type of training, ideas about learning, interests, and values, for example, curriculum materials, socioeconomic status of the community, and peer influences. This complexity produces two outcomes that teachers find both frustrating and challenging. Number one, students exposed to the same materials and teaching methods are likely to vary in how much and what they learn. And number two, a teacher's effectiveness is likely to vary from class to class and year to year. Selection and interpretation of data. Have you ever had an argument with a friend in which you supported your view with certain facts and figures, but your friend supported his or her position with a different set of facts and figures? Or perhaps both of you used the same set of facts but drew different conclusions from them. Well, researchers do exactly the same thing. Why? For the same reason you sometimes disagree with others. The amount of scientific information available on behavior and mental processes is so extensive that no individual could examine or interpret all of it. Accordingly, researchers learn to be highly selective in their reading. In addition, conclusions about the meaning of scientific results vary from one researcher to another. As you read this book, you will discover that there are differences of opinion among psychologists regarding certain aspects of development, motivation, and intelligence. Opposing views may be based on equally scientific evidence, but the ways in which the evidence is selected and interpreted will vary. The fact that a topic is studied scientifically does not necessarily mean that opinions about interpretations of the data will be unanimous. Here's an example of what we mean. When a New York Times reporter, Richtel, interviewed experts about the benefits of computer technology in schools, he received two rather different responses. On the one hand, Larry Cuban, a former education professor at Stanford University, noted that because the standardized test scores of students whose learning is largely computer-based are about the same as students who learn from more conventional means, schools should not spend large sums of money on educational technology. On the other hand, Karen Cater, the director of the Office of Educational Technology in the U.S. Department of Education, at the time the article was written, agreed that test scores were flat, but said that we should look at such other desirable outcomes as learning how to use the internet to do research, learning how to organize one's work, learning how to use professional writing tools, and learning how to collaborate with others. So for one expert, the glass is half, if not mostly empty, while for the other expert, it is at least half full. Frustrating? Yes, but it comes with the territory. New findings mean revised ideas. Scientific information is not only voluminous and subject to different interpretations, it is also constantly being revised. A series of experiments may lead to the development of a new concept or pedagogical technique that is highly successful when it is first tried out. Subsequent studies, however, may reveal that the original research was incomplete, or repeated applications of a technique may show that it is less effective once the novelty has worn off. But frequent shifts of emphasis in education also reflect the basic nature of science. A quality of science that sets it apart from other intellectual processes is that the discoveries by one generation of scientists set the stage for far-reaching discoveries by the next. More researchers are studying aspects of psychology and education now than at any previous time in history, and thousands of reports of scientific research are published every month. To repeat what we said earlier, as our knowledge accumulates, it is inevitable that interpretations of how children learn and how we should teach will continue to change. We know more about development, learning, and teaching today than ever before, but because of the nature of some of the factors just discussed and the complexity of human behavior, our answers are tentative and incomplete. Take, for example, the case of neuroscience research. On the one hand, many educators argue that enough is known about how the brain works under various circumstances to use these findings to create what are called brain-based approaches to education. On the other hand, critics argue that while the results of neuroscience research are promising, those studies were not conducted under realistic classroom conditions, nor are the results sufficiently consistent to serve as a basis for instructional tactics or programs. When and if a consensus develops among researchers that brain-based research has something of value to offer teachers, as happened with social cognitive theory, which we will discuss at length in Chapter 9, future readers of this book will read about it here. One of our objectives in writing this text is to demonstrate the importance of basing your practices on principles that have solid research support.